At the Suez Canal, now the border between Egypt and Israel, the Egyptians launched a war of attrition, and the Israelis fought back. With growing casualties, political attitudes in both countries hardened. There was renewed conflict in the Jordan Valley as well. Israeli soldiers were in constant pursuit of Palestinians who crossed into the West Bank to attack Israeli targets. There was no talk of peace. Inside Jordan, the Palestinians were busy building up their forces. Their charter called for the replacement of Israel by a Palestinian state and the expulsion of all Jews who arrived after 1948. In 1967, a small band of Palestinian guerrillas set up a camp in Karame in the Jordan River Valley. From the bank of the Jordan, they could see the Israeli soldiers patrolling the West Bank.
We waited until the Israeli patrol vehicle had passed by. Then we started to cross the river. The first to cross was Abu Ammar.
Abu Ammar, or Yasser Arafat, was an engineer who became one of the founders of a resistance group called Fatah. This was their first crossing of the River Jordan, launching their campaign to establish a Palestinian state.
We know that is not easy. But we are ready to pay the price.
On me, the water of the River Jordan came up to here. On taller people, of course, it wouldn't come so far up. Now, Arafat is short, and the water came up to his shoulder. He had his clothes on top of his head, and he waded slowly, slowly. If he slipped, he would fall, and everything would get wet, especially his gun.
Beyond the river, in the occupied West Bank, the Fatah guerrillas set about recruiting and training small resistance groups to strike at Israel.
The best targets were the ones we could take by surprise. For example, moving vehicles. You open fire, a group of 3 or 4 of you. Then, if you throw 1 or 2 grenades, that settles it. You're safe, and they're dead.
The guerrillas had the support of Jordan's regular army.
At first, I encouraged them when they went on operations. We would provide covering fire as they crossed the river.
If the Israelis hit back, the Kingdom of Jordan would take the blow.
So I asked His Majesty to meet them.
I had never seen a photograph of Arafat up to that point, or had a description of him. So I was looking at a sort of a big burly figure that I thought must be Arafat. And when he finally came to say goodbye, I suddenly realized it wasn't the image I had formed of Arafat.
The actions launched from Karame worried the king, but he was unable to stop them.
Karame had become a huge military base in Jordan. The terrorists there were sending units into Israel. The straw that broke the camel's back was an attack on an Israeli bus taking pupils on a school trip south of the Dead Sea. It hit a Palestinian mine. Children were killed and injured.
In response, the Israeli army was ordered to destroy the Palestinian bases in Karame and south of the Dead Sea.
We were not very careful. After the 1967 war, we didn't take the enemy seriously. We didn't bother to hide any of our troop movements.
They came blatantly with their tanks and artillery and troops messed up. So we realized that something was about to happen. I think they were overconfident. Early in the morning, at about 5, we were told that the first Israeli elements had crossed one of the bridges.
The Israelis attacked. Facing them were 300 Palestinian fighters with orders from Arafat to hold their ground. By midday, half of them were dead, and most of the rest were rounded up.
Arafat had slipped out of there at 2 o'clock in the morning.
But the battle wasn't over yet. Jordanian army tanks arrived in force.
I jumped when I was told the Israeli tanks were coming. I jumped out of bed. Shoot, I said. I was jumping with excitement. I wanted to face the Jews.
Excitement.
I wanted to teach them a lesson. Yes, by God, I did.
The Jordanian involvement in the battle was very massive. We destroyed many of their tanks.
29 Israelis died in the battle. The Palestinians declared victory.
We faced this huge, up-to-date military Israeli forces. In the beginning, we were alone. After 5 hours, some small battalions from the Jordanian government attended us and fought with us without any central instructions from their headquarters. But at the end, it was the first victory for the Arab nation after this big defeat of 1967.
They claimed it to be a victory for them. We wouldn't have disputed that except for the fact that it wasn't true.
But it was a public relations triumph. Arafat was chosen to command all the factions in the Palestine Liberation Organization. Inspired by the stories of a great victory at Karame, volunteers from many countries came to swell the ranks.
But unfortunately, the majority were the worst type of people. They were untrained and undisciplined. The PLO grew larger, and our problems grew with it.
It was total anarchy. We had 52 various guerrilla organizations of all various types, and they weren't just Palestinian guerrilla organizations. Every international guerrilla organization had a presence in the country.
We were naive people. We were very enthusiastic, very revolutionary, and at the same time, we were, and I can assure you, we were very innocent. We felt that King Hussein, as a reactionary leader, leading a reactionary regime, is an obstacle, and that in order to make our revolution succeed, we need to remove this obstacle.
One day, shooting broke out in the capital, Amman, and the king drove off to investigate.
And on a crossroad, where there was a military police checkpost, we found that one side of the road was closed and the other side also was blocked by an army lorry. We stopped.
As we came to a stop, suddenly we were under very, very intense heavy machine gun fire. The guard car in front of me was hit. We lost a sergeant of my guard and about 4 wounded. Everyone jumped out of my car and yelled at me to do the same.
We could see the bullets from those heavy machine guns coming down at us, hitting the asphalt, the tarmac around us. It was like raindrops on a parched land, just making holes. And those rows of holes were getting closer and closer to where we were standing.
I felt very angry. And I believe my reaction was to say a bad word, but essentially to the effect of, how dare they?
The king jumped into a ditch.
Spontaneously, on the spur of the moment, I had an idea to protect His Majesty physically, and the commander of the guards had the same idea at the same time.
They converged from both sides to try to give me body cover, and they nearly broke my back in the process.
Their driver turned the car around.
We got into the car, shooting going on. Engine was revving like mad, but we were still stationary. So I told the driver, just hang on a second and engage the gear, which in his anxiety had forgotten to do, and we shot off.
The faction most determined to overthrow the government of Jordan was led by George Habash.
All we wanted to do was to fight against Israel. But the Jordanian regime saw us as a danger or a threat. This was their problem, not ours.
Dr. Habash was the leader of a political party, and they decided to remove King Hussein. But from our point of view, we don't like to fight against the government, but if they are insisting to clash, we'll fight.
On September 9th, 1970, this British airliner with 115 passengers and some of Dr. Habash's armed men aboard appeared over Amman.
I heard about it when an aircraft passed overhead my house west of the city in the suburbs, practically knocking the roof off.
In a single spectacular operation, Habash's men hijacked 4 Western airliners and forced 3 of them to fly to Jordan with their hundreds of passengers. The planes landed on an old World War II airstrip in the desert.
We waited for 20 full years. Nothing happened. Our people remained in their camps, in their tents. They are fed up with this condition.
We thought that the way to attract the world's attention to our cause was to hijack planes.
The Jordanian army surrounded the airstrip, and the general in charge went in to negotiate with the hijackers.
We spoke for hours. It was terribly hot. I stayed in the shade of the aircraft. I made a deal with them. We take the passengers, they keep the planes.
435 passengers and crew were taken off the aircraft, but some were kept as hostages.
The humiliation of having aircraft flown into the country and innocent passengers being whisked away and being unable to do anything about it was something that questioned whether Jordan really existed or whether it didn't.
The hijackers then drove home their message to the world.
Well, that was the limit. As far as I was concerned, something had to be done, and done soon.
4 days later, with control of the kingdom slipping away, King Hussein declared war on the PLO. That day, Jordanian tanks and soldiers moved into position around the capital. Arab was poised to fight Arab.
I think I tried to get a little bit of sleep that night. I prayed a lot. And in the morning, first light, there was movement into the city.
In the early hours of September 17, I woke up when we heard the artillery bombing our bases. So what we did immediately is that we went to Arafat office, the Joint Command. Arafat was there. Most of the leaders of Fatah were there. Even Habash was there, and they were calling through telephone and through wireless Damascus, telling them about the news and asking in an open way for a Syrian intervention.
On the third day of fierce fighting, the Syrians responded.
Our intelligence and our radar informed us that the Syrians were massing tank formations on the Jordanian-Syrian border.
We had been arguing over this Syrian invasion, particularly with our Soviet friends at the time. And whenever I raised the problem with the Soviet ambassador, he would respond, but these are Palestinian army units and Palestinian army tanks. They are not Syrian.
And we all knew that the PLO does not have tanks.
But there were tanks, Soviet-built ones, streaming in from Syria.
We were just protecting the Palestinians from the army of Jordan. Our purpose wasn't really to attack the Jordanians. It was a limited intervention on the smallest possible scale. All we wanted to do was support and protect the Palestinian fighters.
In Washington, President Nixon called in his national security advisors to assess the reports from Jordan.
The Soviets were on every platoon leader's tank right up to the border and then jumped off as they crossed the border. And Syrian officers were in command of what were allegedly PLO volunteer forces. So we knew it was an international superpower crisis.
The president summoned the Soviet ambassador.
We warned the Russians and said, stay out of there. They, of course, in turn warned us and said, you stay out and keep Israel out.
In the meantime, King Hussein's forces had destroyed many of the Syrian tanks, but they could not stop the advance. The pressure on the king was increasing by the hour.
When the Syrian tanks had reached the town of Irbid, which is about 2/3 of the way from the Syrian border down to Amman. They're about at that town, on the edge of it. That's when he was really starting to panic.
With all the threats from almost every direction, and the situation, to all intents and purposes, looking almost impossible to cope with. Army headquarters began to tell me that we needed help from outside, and we should ask for it from the Americans and any quarter that would be willing to help.
In these circumstances, any quarter could mean only one thing: Israel.
We knew that he had said he would accept help from any quarter, and we thought he'd probably prefer direct American intervention.
He was keenly aware that if he was resurrected and protected as a result of Israeli military intervention, that this would have a strongly negative impact, not only within Jordan itself, but obviously within the entire world.
This was something that was discussed between Cisco, myself, Haig, and one or two of my staff people.
The advisors knew that President Nixon would have to be informed about the situation right away.
I first had to find him, and the Secret Service told me he was in the basement of the executive office building across the street from the White House, bowling. And that's where I found him.
I remember Henry coming back into the office. He said, "Holy mackerel, the guy's bowling with his black dress shoes on."
He was there bowling alone, and we just started talking. He wanted to have an American intervention.
And of course, we didn't just have an empty cannon there. That's why we moved some fleet units over into that part of the Mediterranean. And that is why we alerted a couple of Marine battalions as well.
I thought it would have been very difficult to manage. We didn't have a commander. We didn't have the right combination of forces. We didn't know how to end it.
Mr. President, we said, we think the Israelis are in the best position to do this. They're close to the scene. The resources can be employed rapidly.
Once he understood that, he agreed to back the Israelis.
Hussein was quite aware of and approved of what we were doing in this thing, and if he didn't approve, he didn't let us know.
It was America's ambassador in Jordan who broke the news to King Hussein.
And what I was told to say to him is, we'll get the Israelis to come in and help you. And I think this is a very serious moment for the king.
We asked Rabin what the views of the Israeli government would be in these circumstances, and Rabin said he would report home and ask.
I got the authorization to send Phantoms to fly over these tanks. I briefed the leader of the formation myself. I told him, fly over them. Leave no doubt that they see you and hear you. Make mock attacks so that they understand what we want them to do, which is to turn around and go back. So our 4 aircraft perform maneuvers over these tanks. On the side, I had another 2 quartets waiting, just in case. But no one bothered them. The tanks turned around and went back. A quartet of Phantoms was enough.
Defense Minister Assad did not want to commit our Air Force. We were fighting an ally. The Jordanian army is our friend. We can't attack them using planes.
Whether it was because of Arab solidarity or the threat of Nixon's 6th Fleet and Israel's warplanes, Syria finally withdrew its tanks. The Jordanian army could now give all its attention to kicking out the Palestinians. Yasser Arafat, hiding somewhere in the capital, sent out an SOS.
I remember that he made the broadcasting through the station we had, asking the Arab world and the Islamic world to intervene.
The Arab world heard him. Its leaders gathered in Cairo for an emergency meeting, chaired by President Nasser. Nasser decided that the leaders should send a delegation to Jordan to ask King Hussein to stop killing Palestinians. At the head of this delegation was the president of Sudan.
We went to King Hussein. Of course, he offered us every kind of delicious dish.
They kept telling us that you have to stop things immediately. But we can't stop. I mean, we're in the middle of a life and death struggle.
Then we stayed for dinner, going through all the arguments.
I believe that that experience was one of my worst during that particular period of time. Because one is concerned, one is worried, one is trying to deal with problems changing every minute, and suddenly to have to entertain a group that is totally out of touch with reality or with the needs of the moment.
And we kept on talking and going through all the reasons until daybreak.
The Arab leaders, having failed to convince the king, got into an armored car and tuned in the radio.
We started to hear Arafat talking, and Arafat calling for help.
The leaders went to Arafat's hideout and provided him with a new identity, a family man complete with wife and child.
We passed off the child as Arafat's, so that the guards at the airport would not stop us. And we made Arafat change into Arabian dress.
Thus disguised, amid the delegation of Arab leaders, Arafat made it past King Hussein's soldiers guarding the airport.
And then suddenly I heard with utter shock and disbelief that they arrived in Cairo. They had Arafat with them.
Arafat had had a close shave in more ways than one. Back in Cairo, President Numeri reported on the conflict.
It was unfair to Jordan and to King Hussein.
King Hussein decided that he too had better join the meeting in Cairo.
I, of course, came in still in my fatigues and with my gun in position.
And he spoke in the conference and responded to the allegations. He said he was not against the Palestinians at all.
President Nasser imposed a deal which met most of King Hussein's demands. Arafat gave in. He agreed all his fighters would leave the capital. The PLO tried to regroup in the north of Jordan, and it took King Hussein another year to drive them out of the country altogether. The PLO's attempt to take over Jordan had failed.
But we did a very important thing. We create a new people. And instead of being refugees, to be fighters. This is very important. We were refugees, homeless. We became now fighters, freedom fighters. And next stage, you will see.
Arafat and his battered fighters moved to Lebanon, where they regrouped. Soon, Arafat would be strong enough to become a power broker in Lebanon and continue his attacks on Israelis.
The Olympic Games stand still. The flags in the stadium at half-mast. The citizens of Munich, the thousands of competitors and officials.
Palestinian guerrillas crowned a year of terrorist attacks by storming the Olympic Village.
This hastily conceived memorial ceremony.
11 Israeli athletes were killed as the world watched. Israel retaliated with a pinpoint operation. An Israeli commando force landed on a beach near Beirut. Their targets were PLO leaders, particularly those responsible for Munich. Arafat, who was working late at the PLO's busy headquarters, escaped. But the guerrillas who planned and carried out the Munich operation were killed. At the funerals, the Palestinians and their Muslim allies erupted in fury. To everyone's astonishment, this man turned up at the funeral. Pierre Jamal, Christian Maronite leader, suspected by some Palestinians of collaborating with Israel. Jamal led a Christian militia, the Phalange. He warned Arafat to stay out of his conflict with the Lebanese Muslims.
Pierre Jamal thought hard before attending the funeral. The security people of the Phalange warned him not to go. They said Pierre Jamal would be in danger.
In April 1975, civil war broke out in Lebanon, and Arafat became a force to be reckoned with. He asked for a meeting with Jamal at the Christian clan leader's headquarters. As Arafat drove through Beirut, it was clear that the Christians considered him an enemy.
We drove past slogans on the walls saying no to the PLO. He laughed and said to me, "We must do something about this, or Lebanon will explode."
The civil war escalated. Arafat aligned himself with the Muslims, while Christians sought the help of Israel. The Christian leader then gave the PLO an ultimatum.
We are asking the Palestinians to stay quiet. If they want to remain in Lebanon, to stay quiet in Lebanon. I don't think that we are going to accept in the future that any war can be waged from Lebanon, from the Lebanon borders, because this, and the past experience has proved it, this will prove disastrous for Lebanon.
Arafat ignored the warning. 1974 had seen a succession of Palestinian raids across the border into Israel. In one attack, 18 Israelis, including 8 children, died. A month later, Palestinian raiders took over a school and killed 22 children. Israel's main anti-terrorist efforts shifted along with the PLO attacks. Now the Jordanian border was quiet, and there was fighting on the Lebanese border.
I was appointed commander of a brigade on the Lebanese border. All our efforts were aimed at preventing terrorist infiltration. Hardly a week passed without 2 or 3 attempts to cross the border.
Israel, surrounded by hostile Muslim states, badly needed allies. When Lebanon's Christians were challenged by the Palestinians and Lebanese Muslims, they asked for Israel's help. Defense Minister Shimon Peres sent an Arabic-speaking officer on a secret mission to Beirut.
In my heart, I decided that such a man must volunteer. His life would certainly be at risk.
And when I told him I was willing, he smiled. He said, "It's very dangerous." I said, "I know."
I saw Fuad's mission as a trip to a minefield, a place where there are many traitors.
The Israeli officers set off aboard a missile boat, sailing in darkness towards civil war-torn Beirut.
All Beirut was lit by cannon fire. A city like hell. Unbelievable. One big conflagration.
The intelligence officer knew that the Christians were faring badly against the Palestinians. His Christian hosts sped him towards the battlefront.
Suddenly, I saw thousands of people lining the road and clapping. I said to my host, "What's this?" He said, "Let's take a look." Then I see 2 trucks coming up. One truck has men shooting in the air. The other has ropes tied to it. At the end of each of these ropes is the body of a PLO terrorist, and this truck is dragging them along the ground. And the men on the back of the truck are just shooting and shooting at them, although they had long been dead. I was simply shocked.
Lebanese Muslims and Christians and Palestinians fought and murdered each other with ferocity. Some 40,000 would die on both sides. A British journalist reported, "At its most hideous, this civil war has been simple. Muslims have murdered Christians, Christians have murdered Muslims. Not in battle, but in cold blood." These men were innocents, kidnapped in the street, taken to a secret place, tortured, shot, and then dumped in the street again for their families to find. The Israeli intelligence officer confirmed deep anti-PLO feeling among the Christians. They desperately needed help.
They asked us for weapons, everything. Rifles, Kalashnikovs, Uzis. They asked for cannons. We gave them. Mortars and tanks. We gave them.
In 1981, Ariel Sharon became Israel's defense minister. Soon after, the Christian leaders came to a Beirut beach to await a visitor.
As I landed, Bashir Gemayel came towards me. He hugged me, shook my hand. He had his officers with him.
Bashir, the son of Christian leader Pierre Gemayel, now controlled the weapons supplied by Israel. He had ruthlessly eliminated his rivals and united all the Christian forces under his command. Sharon, at a meeting with the Christian leaders, revealed a plan to root out the Palestinians.
فقال للقادة المسيحيين اعلموا
He told the Christian leaders, "We have taken a decision in Israel to invade Lebanon.
باجتياح لبنان القرار متخذ وإننا ننتظر الفرصة لتنفيذ هذا الاجتياح."
Sharon told the Christians they would have to help. Israel's troops could not march into an Arab capital. Expelling the Palestinians from the city would be the task of the Christians.
I said, "Remember, if an invasion happens, it's a mission you will have to carry out. You, and only you, can do this."
But the Israelis could advance to the outskirts of Beirut and encircle the city. 6 months later, the Palestinians provided Israel with a pretext for invasion. In London, the Israeli ambassador was shot by a Palestinian. As police gathered evidence, Prime Minister Begin summoned his cabinet.
He turned to me and asked me to brief my colleagues.
Ariel Sharon said nothing about his plan to encircle Beirut. He spoke only of pushing the Palestinians back from Israel's northern border.
Then Mr. Ehrlich, God rest his soul, asked, "What about Beirut?" I said, "Beirut isn't in the picture. The plan is to create a 40 to 45 kilometer area in which there will be no terrorists."
Israeli forces crossed the border and moved rapidly into Lebanon. But Prime Minister Begin reassured the Israeli parliament.
And if we achieve the 40-kilometer line above our northern border, the job is done. All fighting will stop.
But within hours, Sharon found an excuse for pushing farther.
We got information that units of the 1st Syrian Division were moving south. towards the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon.
Sharon persuaded Begin that Israel's troops should now advance deeper into Lebanon to outflank this Syrian force. It would mean going beyond 45 kilometers.
Whoever said we would give terrorists immunity beyond the 45-kilometer line? The government never gave immunity to any terrorist anywhere. We will not give immunity to any terrorist anywhere.
Within 3 days of telling the cabinet that Beirut was not in the picture, Ariel Sharon had moved Israel's troops to the outskirts of the Lebanese capital. For 9 weeks, they laid siege to Beirut, exchanging fire with the Palestinians.
We are here, and we will continue to be here, and we will defend this city, the first, it is very important, it is the first Arab capital which the Israelis are blockading. It is very important. You have to put in consideration what it means for the next generation. What have been done, you will pay its price.
The harder Arafat fought back, the more people in Lebanon suffered. Their capital was being destroyed. Even Lebanese Muslims demanded that Arafat and his fighters leave Beirut.
I was the one who had to raise the question with Arafat. He was shocked. No one had spoken to him like that before. I said, well, we are informing you now.
The Israelis drove the message home by staying close on the heels of the Palestinian leaders.
وأكاد أقول أن إسرائيل الجيش الإسرائيلي
The Israeli army seemed to know what we were going to do before we did.
بتوجهاتنا السياسية. فعندما
If we spoke about fighting on, we were attacked by the Israelis 1 hour later.
نشعر بردود الفعل الإسرائيلية بعد ساعة من الزمن.
There was a meeting in one of our headquarters, and I tell them, please, get out. Leave it. Just now, he said, you are inviting us for a meeting. He said, please, leave this place directly. I don't know why. Believe me, I don't know why. After 15 minutes from our departure, they bombed.
In a cellar under the rubble, the PLO leaders faced a stark choice.
وكان قد وصل إلى قناعة ياسر عرفات.
Arafat was convinced that we had to evacuate Beirut.
ولكنه كان حريصا في نفس الوقت أن لا يسجل.
But he was careful to avoid being the one who ordered Palestinian forces to leave Lebanon.
كان يريد أن يكون القرار جماعيا.
He wanted a collective decision by all the faction leaders.
The price of further defiance was clear.
فكان القرار الصعب.
So we took a hard decision. I can say today that everybody accepted it. All of the leaders of the Palestinian Revolution said yes.
In the last days of August 1982, thousands of Palestinian fighters were forced to evacuate Beirut.
Nearly 15,000 men expelled from Beirut. This was unprecedented. An entire terrorist organization expelled from a capital.
Then, in a massive explosion at his party headquarters, Bashir Gemayel, Lebanon's president-elect and Israel's ally, was assassinated. The Israeli defense minister became convinced that Palestinian fighters were still operating in Beirut.
They left behind at least 2,000 armed men. It was clear that once the city was united, it would be necessary to take action against them.
Christian militiamen sought vengeance for the death of Jamal, while Israeli troops stood by, providing light from flares. The phalangists entered the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila. There were no PLO fighters there. They found only old men, women, and children, and slaughtered them.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
I am not here to explain this horrible tragedy. It belongs to a world of dark motives, not our world. Only those who carried it out can be blamed for this massacre. I hope they will be punished.
You are an enemy of the people. You are worse than evil.
In the largest demonstration in Israel's history, 400,000 people protested Israel's role in the massacre.
It is true that we lost our base in Beirut, but they lost the war.
Once again, through a combined effort of Arabs and Israelis, the PLO had been driven out of an Arab country. Yasser Arafat, the great escaper, was on his way to yet another base, this time in Tunis, 2,000 miles away.